My name is Sarah Bennett. I'm 45 years old, and I've spent 22 years as a clinical psychologist. In that time, I've heard stories that would break most people. But some stories, they don't just stay with you, they change you. Thomas was 47 years old, a retired soldier, a man who had spent years on battlefields, who had faced death more times than most people face difficult decisions. But when he sat across from me that day, what I saw wasn't a soldier. What I saw was a man who had been hollowed out, as if someone had spent years scooping out everything inside him with a spoon, taking piece after piece until only the shell remained. For the first 5 minutes, he didn't speak. He just stared at his hands. His fingers were thick, calloused from years of handling weapons and equipment, but they lay in his lap like they belonged to someone else, like he had forgotten what they were for. Then he whispered something, so quiet I had to lean forward to hear. My wife left me, after 25 years, and I don't feel anything. I should be sad, shouldn't I? But I'm not. I'm just empty, like there's something missing inside me that should be there. Maybe it was never there at all. I paused. This wasn't the grief of a man mourning a marriage. This was something else entirely. This was a man questioning his own existence. I had heard many things in my career, but rarely had I encountered someone so completely disconnected from themselves. Thomas's emptiness wasn't depression. It wasn't the natural numbness that sometimes follows loss. No, that emptiness had been deliberately created, carved out over decades, and the person who had done it was the woman who had slept beside him every night for 25 years. In some sessions, my patients heal as they speak, but some stories stay with me long after they leave my office. Today, I'm going to share one of those lives with you. If you're listening to this story and there are things inside you that you can't hold in anymore, share what you're feeling in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. I hear every story. If you want to hear more therapy stories that I couldn't forget, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If this story touches something in you, you can support me by liking. One day, I'd like to hear your story too. If you want me to share your story in my next video, you can send it to the email address in my profile. Remember, our stories heal a little when they're shared. Before I tell you what happened to Thomas, I need you to understand something. This man had survived war. He had been shot at, ambushed, seen friends die in front of him. He had carried wounded soldiers on his back through enemy fire. He had made decisions in seconds that determined whether people lived or died. He had received 4 medals for bravery. 4. Each one representing a moment where he had put his life on the line for others. A Bronze Star for valor under fire, a Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. 2 Army Commendation Medals for exceptional service. These weren't participation trophies. These were earned with blood and courage. Those medals no longer exist. They were thrown in the trash. By his wife. She said she was cleansing the house of negative energy. Thomas didn't argue. He couldn't. By then he had forgotten how to argue. He had forgotten how to want anything for himself. He had forgotten how to be Thomas. But that wasn't the worst of it. Not even close. Thomas had a daughter. Had. Because she ran away at 18 and hasn't spoken to him since. She believes her father never loved her. She believes he was cold, distant, uncaring. But Thomas adored his daughter. He would have died for her without hesitation. So how did she come to believe something so completely opposite to the truth? Someone told her. Every day for years, someone whispered poison into her ear until the truth rotted away and only the lie remained. Someone convinced a daughter that her loving father was a monster. And there's more. Thomas didn't bury his own mother. She died while he was deployed, and he wasn't at the funeral. Not because he couldn't get leave, not because of military orders, because his wife told him she would hurt herself if he left. So he stayed. While his mother was lowered into the ground, surrounded by people who loved her, her only son was trapped thousands of miles away, prisoner of a threat he couldn't ignore. What Thomas experienced has a clinical name: coercive control. It's a pattern of behavior that seeks to take away the victim's liberty or freedom, degrade their sense of self, and strip them of their autonomy. Unlike physical abuse, which leaves visible marks, coercive control works invisibly. It dismantles a person's identity piece by piece, so gradually that the victim often doesn't realize what's happening until there's nothing left to save. The most devastating aspect is that victims frequently defend their abusers, unable to recognize the cage they're living in because the bars are made of manipulation, not metal. For soldiers like Thomas, trained to identify external threats, the attack coming from within their own home is often impossible to detect. But here's what made Thomas's case different from others I had seen. He didn't come to me because he finally recognized the abuse. He came because a stranger on the street asked if he needed help. He had been sitting on a park bench for 3 hours, crying, and he didn't know why. He couldn't remember sitting down. He couldn't remember starting to cry. He had simply disconnected from his own life, like a machine that finally broke down after running too long on empty. That stranger's question was the first time in 25 years that someone had seen Thomas. Really seen him. Not the soldier, not the husband, not the provider, not the protector, not the role he had been assigned. Just the man. The broken, empty, forgotten man who had lost himself so completely he didn't even know he was lost. In our first session, I observed Thomas carefully. His posture told me more than his words ever could. He sat at the edge of the chair, as if ready to leave at any moment, as if taking up space was somehow wrong. His shoulders curved inward, making his large frame seem smaller, less threatening, less present. His eyes rarely met mine, instead fixing on a spot somewhere on the floor between us. I noticed the way he held his body, contained, compressed, like he was trying to take up as little room as possible. This was a man who had led soldiers into battle, who had commanded respect and authority. Now he sat before me like a child waiting to be scolded. When I asked him about his marriage, his breathing changed. It became shallow, controlled, the way a soldier breathes when trying to stay calm under fire. But there was no enemy here, just a question about the woman he had shared his life with. And that reaction told me everything about where the real battlefield had been. Margaret she needed me. She always needed me. I think that's why I stayed, because someone needed me. His voice cracked on that last word, needed, as if being needed was the only value he recognized in himself, as if his entire existence had been reduced to a single function, meeting someone else's demands. "Tell me about that need," I said softly, keeping my voice neutral, non-threatening. "What did she need from you?" Thomas's hands tightened in his lap. His knuckles whitened. I could see the tendons straining beneath his skin. Everything. She needed me to be there, always. If I wasn't, bad things would happen. What kind of bad things? He swallowed. Once, twice. His Adam's apple moved like he was trying to force something down. His eyes finally lifted to meet mine, and in them I saw something that made my chest tighten. Fear. Raw, conditioned, deeply ingrained fear. This was a man who had faced enemy combatants without flinching, now trembling at the thought of his own wife. She would hurt herself, or she said she would. If I left, if I disagreed, if I did anything she didn't want, she would say she couldn't live without me, that she would end it all, that my leaving would be the same as killing her. Threatening self-harm as a control mechanism is one of the most insidious forms of emotional manipulation. It creates a prison without walls, where the victim becomes both the jailer and the prisoner. They can't leave because they believe their departure will cause harm. They can't express their own needs because any assertion of self becomes a potential trigger for crisis. Over time, the victim learns to erase themselves entirely, to exist only as a function of the other person's demands. They lose the ability to distinguish between their own needs and their partner's needs. Thomas had spent 25 years being held hostage by the fear of what his wife might do to herself. Every decision he made was filtered through a single question. Will this upset Margaret? His entire existence had become a hostage negotiation, where he was both the hostage and the negotiator. But there was something Thomas hadn't told me yet. Something that happened in the 3rd year of his marriage. Something that had set the pattern for everything that followed. Something that explained why a decorated soldier had surrendered so completely to a war he didn't even know he was fighting. It would take 3 more sessions before he could speak of it, and when he did, I understood why he had never been able to leave. Thomas came to our third session looking worse than before. The circles under his eyes had deepened into bruises. His movements were slower, heavier, as if he were walking through water. Something had surfaced between our sessions. Something he had kept buried for over 2 decades. He sat down heavily and for a long moment said nothing. His jaw worked silently, muscles tensing and releasing. I could see him fighting with himself, part of him wanting to speak, part of him desperate to stay silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, roughened by pain. In our 3rd year, I found out Margaret was having an affair with my best friend, David. We had served together, been through things together. I trusted him with my life. I would have taken a bullet for him. His hands gripped his knees so tightly I could see the tendons straining beneath his skin. His knuckles had gone white. I came home early from a training exercise, found them in our bed. Our bed. The bed I had saved for months to buy because Margaret said she wanted something nice. I stood in the doorway and I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain just stopped. He paused, drew a breath that shuddered through his chest. When I confronted her, when I told her I couldn't do this, couldn't stay, she went to the bathroom. She swallowed a bottle of pills, right in front of me, looked me in the eyes and swallowed them one by one. I had to call an ambulance. They pumped her stomach. She almost died, or so they said. He stopped, drew a ragged breath that seemed to tear at his throat. She told me it was my fault, that if I hadn't accused her, if I hadn't been so suspicious, so jealous, so controlling, she wouldn't have done it. She said David was just a friend, that I had imagined things, that my mind was playing tricks on me, and I believed her. I apologized, I promised never to question her again, and I didn't, not for 22 years. Not even when I knew, not even when there were others after David. This was the foundational trauma, the moment where Thomas's identity as an autonomous person began to crumble. Margaret had discovered the ultimate weapon, his conscience, his sense of responsibility, his deep-seated need to protect others, the same quality that had made him a hero in combat. She weaponized his own virtues against him. Every time he might have stood up for himself, every time he might have questioned her behavior, that memory would surface. The image of her limp body, the ambulance lights flashing in the darkness, the doctor's grim face, the beeping of machines. She had created a psychological tripwire, and Thomas had spent the rest of his marriage carefully stepping around it. His truth, what he had witnessed with his own eyes, had been invalidated so thoroughly that he learned to distrust his own perceptions rather than challenge hers. What Thomas didn't know then, what he wouldn't discover until years later, was that Margaret had made similar threats before, to her previous boyfriend, to her own family. The pills she swallowed that night were carefully counted. Just enough to require hospitalization, not enough to cause permanent damage. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a moment of despair. It was a calculated move in a game she had been playing long before Thomas ever met her. And it worked perfectly. It worked so well that she never had to use that particular weapon again. The memory of it was enough to keep Thomas in line for the next 2 decades. After the pill incident, Margaret's control over Thomas became absolute. But she was surgical about it. She never demanded outright. Instead, she made herself seem fragile, vulnerable, the predator disguised as prey. She didn't like my friends, Thomas told me in our 4th session. She said they were a bad influence, that they judged her. One by one, I stopped seeing them. It was easier than dealing with her episodes. What about your family? Something shifted in his face, a flicker of pain so raw it was almost physical. My mother died while I was deployed. Cancer. My sister called, told me Mom was asking for me. She wanted to say goodbye. I started making arrangements to fly home. Margaret had one of her episodes. She said she couldn't cope if I left, that she needed me more than my mother did. His breath caught in his throat. I didn't go. My mother died calling my name, my sister said, and I was thousands of miles away holding my wife while she cried. I've never visited her grave. The shame of it. I still can't. The isolation of victims is a hallmark of coercive control. Abusers systematically cut their victims off from support networks until only 2 people exist, the abuser and the victim. Margaret had severed every connection until Thomas existed in a vacuum where her reality was the only reality. Missing his mother's funeral was the complete erasure of Thomas's identity as a son, as someone with a life that predated Margaret. But the deepest cut was yet to come. Because Margaret hadn't just isolated Thomas from his past, she had also stolen his future. And she had done it by turning his own daughter against him, by poisoning the one relationship that might have saved him. Emma was born 2 years after the pill incident. Thomas described her birth as the happiest moment of his life. For a brief, shining time, he said he felt something other than fear. He felt hope. He felt like himself again. She was perfect, he said, and for the first time since I'd met him, something like warmth entered his voice. His eyes softened. His shoulders relaxed. For a moment, I could see the man he might have been. 10 fingers, 10 toes, this little red face all scrunched up and angry at the world. She grabbed my finger and wouldn't let go. Strongest grip I'd ever felt. I wanted to be the father I never had. I wanted her to know she was loved every single day of her life. That she mattered, that she was wanted, that she was the best thing that ever happened to me. And were you? That kind of father? The warmth drained from his face as quickly as it had appeared, like watching a light switch off. I tried. God, I tried so hard. But Margaret, she was always there. Between us, like a wall I couldn't see but couldn't get through. If I tried to spend time with Emma alone, just father-daughter stuff, Margaret would have a crisis, a headache, a panic attack, something that needed my attention right now. If I disciplined Emma even gently, Margaret would undermine me in front of her. Make me look like the bad guy. And she would tell Emma things about me, at night when they thought I couldn't hear, through the wall, whispers that carried. What kind of things? Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. The words came out broken, jagged, like shattered glass. That I didn't really love her. That I only stayed because of duty, because I had to, not because I wanted to. That I was cold and unfeeling like all military men. That I would leave someday, just like everyone else always leaves. That she was the only one who really loved Emma, the only one Emma could trust. She told her this over and over for years, every night, every time I wasn't there, drip by drip like water on stone. And Emma? Emma believed her mother. Why wouldn't she? Margaret was there every day, every night. I was working. I was doing what I thought I was supposed to do. I was providing. But while I was gone, Margaret was filling our daughter's head with poison. What Margaret did to Emma has a clinical term: parental alienation. It's a form of psychological manipulation where one parent systematically damages the child's relationship with the other parent. The alienating parent plants seeds of doubt, shares adult information inappropriately, portrays themselves as the victim and the other parent as the villain, and positions themselves as the only trustworthy figure in the child's life. Children caught in this dynamic often completely reject the alienated parent, not because of anything that parent actually did, but because of a carefully constructed false narrative that becomes their reality. For Thomas, this was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Margaret's control. She hadn't just taken his sense of self. She hadn't just isolated him from friends and family. She had reached into the future and stolen the one relationship that might have given him a reason to fight back. She had taken his daughter. Emma ran away 3 days after her 18th birthday. She left a note saying she couldn't live in the same house as her father anymore, that she finally felt free, that she was going somewhere he couldn't find her, couldn't hurt her anymore. Thomas read that note standing in her empty room, surrounded by pink walls he had painted himself when she was 7, next to the bookshelf he had built for her, and felt something inside him shatter. But not in the way you might expect. He felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. The emptiness was so complete it was almost a sound, a ringing silence where emotion should have been. By then his ability to feel had been so thoroughly eroded that even losing his daughter couldn't pierce the numbness. And that terrified him more than the loss itself. Thomas earned 4 medals during his military service, a Bronze Star for valor under fire when he carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety while under enemy attack, a Purple Heart for wounds received when shrapnel tore through his leg during an ambush, 2 Army Commendation Medals for exceptional service and leadership. Each one represented a moment where he had risked everything for others, where he had mattered. where he had been fully, undeniably Thomas. I kept them in a box, he told me, in the closet, in the back, behind old shoes and forgotten clothes. I didn't display them or anything. Margaret said it was boastful to show them. Arrogant. She said only insecure men needed to remind themselves of past glories. But I liked knowing they were there. Sometimes, late at night, I would take them out and hold them. They reminded me of who I used to be. Someone who did something. Someone who mattered. Someone who existed. Used to be? I noted his choice of words. He nodded slowly, understanding the significance himself. One day I came home, and they were gone. Margaret had thrown them away. She said she was cleaning out negative energy, that those medals represented death and violence, and she couldn't have that in her house, that they were making her sick, that she had nightmares because of them. Her house, I repeated. That's what she always called it. Her house, her car, her money, her daughter. Even though I was the one who worked, even though I was the one who paid for everything, even though I was the one who built the deck and fixed the roof and mowed the lawn, none of it was ever mine. I was just there, taking up space, being tolerated. Did you try to get the medals back? A long silence. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. No, I didn't even ask. By then, I had learned not to ask for anything, not to want anything. Wanting things led to her crying, to her threats, to her episodes. It was easier to just let go of everything, of my friends, of my mother, of my daughter, of my past, of myself. The destruction of Thomas's medals was symbolic violence. Those medals represented his identity outside of Margaret, outside of their marriage. They were proof that he had existed before her, that he had value beyond being her caretaker, that he had accomplished things that had nothing to do with her. By destroying them, Margaret was erasing his past, his accomplishments, his sense of self-worth. And Thomas's inability to protest, his learned helplessness, showed how thoroughly his will had been broken. He had been trained, conditioned like a dog, not to want, not to need, not to exist as anything other than an extension of Margaret's needs. The medals were the last physical evidence of who Thomas had been. When they went into the trash, so did any remaining connection to his former self. But Margaret's control went deeper than possessions, deeper than relationships, deeper than the systematic destruction of his past. She had also taken control of something far more fundamental, Thomas's sense of reality itself. And uncovering how she did it would take us into the darkest territory of his 25-year imprisonment. In our 6th session, Thomas described experiences that sounded like cognitive decline, losing things constantly, conversations he couldn't remember having, events that shifted in Margaret's retelling. I thought I was going crazy, he said. I would put my keys somewhere and find them elsewhere. Margaret would tell me I said the opposite of what I remembered. I started doubting everything, my memory, my sanity. When did this start? Early, maybe the first year. Little things at first, then bigger things. When I argued, she would cry, say I was calling her a liar, so I stopped arguing. I started believing her version instead of my own memories. Did you ever seek help? Once. I secretly saw a neurologist. Every test came back normal. My brain was healthy. When I told Margaret, she cried, accused me of not trusting her. She didn't speak to me for a week. I chose to believe I was losing my mind rather than accept she was manipulating me. This is gaslighting. The technique works by consistently denying the victim's experience of reality until they doubt their own perceptions. Thomas was a soldier, trained to trust his instincts in life or death situations. Margaret dismantled that confidence until he couldn't trust himself. When someone loses faith in their own perception of reality, they become completely dependent on their abuser to define what is real. Thomas told me he once kept a secret journal. He wrote down things Margaret said, dates, times, trying to track his declining memory. Instead, it showed him something else. Margaret's claims repeatedly contradicted what he had written, but he burned the journal after 6 months. The alternative, that his wife was deliberately driving him insane, was too terrible to contemplate. By our 8th session, Thomas had begun to see patterns he had been blind to for decades. Each revelation came slowly, painfully, like peeling away layers of scar tissue. Some days he would take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Some days the denial would creep back in, and he would find excuses for Margaret, reasons why her behavior made sense. Breaking free of 25 years of conditioning is not a linear process. "She did this on purpose," he said one day, and I could see the realization dawning in his eyes, terrible and clarifying at the same time. Every bit of it. The isolation, the gaslighting, turning Emma against me, throwing away my medals, keeping me from my mother's funeral. It was all calculated, planned, deliberate. She knew exactly what she was doing. His hands were shaking, not with fear this time, with anger. It was the first genuine emotion I had seen from him since we began our work together. The first crack in the numbness. Why didn't I see it? I'm trained to assess threats, to identify enemies, to recognize danger. How did I live with one for 25 years and never know? "Because she didn't look like an enemy," I said gently. "She looked like a wife, like someone who needed you, like someone fragile and vulnerable who would fall apart without your protection. Your training taught you to protect the vulnerable. She used that against you. She exploited the very qualities that made you a good soldier, a good man, to control you completely." Male victims of coercive control often go unrecognized both by themselves and by society. We are conditioned to see men as strong, as protectors, as unable to be victimized by intimate partners. The very concept seems contradictory to our cultural narratives about masculinity. Thomas's military background made this even more pronounced. How could a man who survived combat, who earned medals for bravery, who carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, be controlled by his wife? But abuse doesn't operate on physical strength. It operates on psychological vulnerability. Thomas's sense of duty, his need to protect, his fear of causing harm, his deep-seated belief in his own responsibility for others' well-being, these qualities that made him a hero on the battlefield made him a perfect victim at home. Margaret had identified his pressure points and exploited them systematically, using his own virtues as weapons against him. But understanding the cage didn't immediately free Thomas from it. Knowledge is not the same as healing. Recognition is not the same as recovery. Because there was still one more truth he needed to face. Something about Margaret that explained everything. Something that would come not from therapy, but from an unexpected source. Margaret's own family. 3 months into our work together, Thomas received a letter. It was from Margaret's sister, a woman he had met only twice in 25 years of marriage. Margaret had always claimed her family was toxic, had cut off contact with them early in the marriage. She said they were jealous of her happiness, that they had never supported her, that they were dangerous people who couldn't be trusted. Thomas had never questioned it. The letter was 6 pages long, handwritten on pale blue paper. Thomas brought it to our session, his face pale, his hands unsteady. "Her sister wrote to me because she heard about the divorce," he said, "through mutual friends. She wanted me to know. She wanted me to understand that Margaret had done this before me." He unfolded the letter with trembling hands. "There was a boyfriend before me, in college. His name was Michael. She did the same thing to him. The threats, the control, the suicide attempts when he tried to leave. He eventually escaped, but it took him years to recover. He's still in therapy, decades later. And their mother? Their mother was the same with their father. Exactly the same. The threats, the manipulation, the complete control. Their father was a husk of a man by the time he died. Margaret learned it from watching her mother destroy her father. She learned that this is how you keep someone. This is how you love." He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw something new. Not just anger, not just pain, but the beginning of understanding. She wasn't born this way. She was made this way, and she remade me the same way her mother remade her father, the same way she would have remade Emma if Emma hadn't escaped. It's a cycle, a pattern. It just keeps repeating. Patterns of coercive control often run through generations like a hereditary disease. Children who grow up watching one parent systematically control and diminish the other internalize those dynamics as normal, as the template for what relationships look like. Some become victims themselves, unconsciously seeking out controlling partners because that dynamic feels familiar, feels like home, feels like what love is supposed to be. Others become controllers, replicating the only model of relationship they ever knew. Margaret wasn't inherently evil. She wasn't born a monster. She was a product of a deeply dysfunctional system, passing on the same wounds she had received, perpetuating a cycle that perhaps stretched back generations before her mother. This doesn't excuse her behaviour. It caused real and profound harm. Thomas lost decades of his life, his relationship with his daughter, his mother's funeral, his sense of self. But it does provide context. Hurt people hurt people. And until that cycle is recognised and deliberately broken, it continues from generation to generation, leaving a trail of broken lives in its wake. Understanding where Margaret's behaviour came from didn't undo the damage. But it gave Thomas something crucial: permission to stop blaming himself. For 25 years he had believed that if he were just better, more patient, more loving, more present, more understanding, Margaret would be happy, and the abuse would stop. He had internalized the narrative that he was the problem, that his inadequacies were the cause of her distress. Now he understood that nothing he could have done would have been enough. The cage wasn't built for a reason. It was built because building cages was all Margaret knew how to do. And that realization, painful as it was the first step toward freedom. Recovery from coercive control is not linear. There are no sudden breakthroughs, no dramatic moments of healing, no Hollywood epiphanies where everything clicks into place. Instead, it happens in small increments, tiny reclamations of self that gradually accumulate into something resembling a whole person. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Some days feeling like progress, other days feeling like the work has barely begun. For Thomas, the first sign of change came in an unexpected form. "I went to a coffee shop yesterday," he told me in our 10th session. His voice was different, steadier. There was something in it that hadn't been there before. By myself. Just walked in off the street. And when the barista asked what I wanted, I didn't know. I stood there for 5 minutes trying to remember what kind of coffee I liked. Margaret always ordered for me, in restaurants, in coffee shops, everywhere. She said I took too long to decide, and it annoyed her. I hadn't chosen my own drink in over 20 years. I couldn't remember what I liked. I couldn't remember if I even liked coffee. "What did you order?" A small smile crossed his face. It was the first time I had seen him smile. The expression seemed to surprise even him. "Black coffee. Large. No sugar. No cream, nothing fancy. It's what I used to drink in the army before I met her. Sitting in mess halls at 4 in the morning, getting ready for missions. I had forgotten how much I loved that taste, how it reminded me of feeling capable, of feeling like myself. I sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours, just drinking coffee and watching people, and for the first time in decades, I felt present, like I was actually there, like I existed. This seemingly trivial moment, choosing a coffee, represented something profound. Victims of coercive control lose the ability to make decisions, even small ones. Their preferences, desires, and opinions have been systematically invalidated for so long that they forget they ever had them. The abuser's preferences become the only preferences that matter, the only ones that exist. The victim becomes a blank slate, existing only to serve another's needs. The process of recovery involves rediscovering those buried preferences, one small choice at a time. A coffee order, a television show, a colour, a song. Each choice is an act of reclamation, a declaration that the self still exists beneath all the layers of control and manipulation. For Thomas, that cup of black coffee was the first step toward rebuilding an identity that had been systematically dismantled over a quarter century. Over the following months, Thomas slowly pieced himself back together. He was not becoming the Thomas he had been before Margaret. That man was gone forever. He was becoming someone new. He reconnected with 2 old army friends. Margaret had always intercepted their calls over the years. Now they sat together in a bar, 3 aging soldiers, and talked about things that mattered. They didn't understand everything Thomas had been through, but they didn't need to. They just needed to be there. He visited his mother's grave for the first time. 20 years late, he stood there for 3 hours, talking to a stone. He told her everything, about Margaret, about Emma. He apologized for not being there. He didn't know if forgiveness was possible across the boundary of death, but he needed to say the words, and he started making decisions. What to eat, what to watch, what colour to paint his apartment. Each decision was a tiny act of rebellion against 25 years of conditioning. But perhaps the most significant change came not from what Thomas gained, but from what he was finally able to feel. Because in our 12th session, Thomas did something that surprised us both. 6 months into our work, Thomas decided to write to his daughter. It was a difficult decision, fraught with fear and uncertainty. He didn't know if she would read the letter. He didn't know if she would believe him. He didn't know if reaching out would push her further away or open a door that had seemed permanently closed. But he knew he had to try. The alternative, living with the silence forever, was worse. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he told me, his eyes wet but his voice steady. "I'm not even asking her to understand. I just want her to know the truth. What happened? Why I was the way I was, why I couldn't protect her the way I should have, and that I loved her. I always loved her, every single day, even when I couldn't show it, even when her mother made sure she couldn't see it, even when I was too trapped to be the father she deserved." He wrote that letter over the course of 3 weeks. Each session, he would share pieces of it with me, asking for feedback, questioning whether he was being too harsh on Margaret, too easy on himself, too detailed, not detailed enough. It was a delicate balance, telling the truth without vilifying, taking responsibility without accepting blame that wasn't his, explaining without making excuses. He mailed it on a Tuesday afternoon, walked to the post office himself, held the envelope for a long moment, then dropped it into the slot. Then he waited. 3 weeks passed with no response. Thomas tried to prepare himself for silence, for rejection, for the possibility that his daughter was lost to him forever. He told himself that he had done what he could, that the rest was up to her, that he had to accept whatever she decided. But I could see the hope in his eyes, despite everything. The stubborn, fragile, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. And then on a grey afternoon in November, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, an area code from a city he had never been to. He answered anyway. Habit, maybe, or something deeper. And the voice on the other end was the voice he hadn't heard in 5 years, the voice of the baby who had grabbed his finger and wouldn't let go. "Dad?" Thomas came to our next session transformed, not healed. Healing is a longer process, but changed. Something in his posture had shifted. He sat back in the chair instead of perching on its edge. His eyes met mine directly. His shoulders were straighter. There was colour in his face that hadn't been there before. "She called me," he said, and his voice cracked. "Emma called me. She read the letter. 3 times, she said. She cried so hard she couldn't breathe, and she said she needed time to process everything, but she wanted to hear my side. She wanted to understand. She wanted to know if what I wrote was true." How did that conversation go? It was hard, probably the hardest conversation of my life. Harder than any mission briefing, any combat situation, any death notification I ever had to deliver. She had questions, difficult questions. She wanted to know why I never protected her from Margaret's manipulation, why I let it happen, why I didn't fight for her, and I had to tell her the truth. I didn't know it was happening. I was so controlled myself, so deep in the fog that I couldn't see what was being done to her. I couldn't save her because I couldn't even save myself. He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. She's starting to remember things differently now. Things her mother told her that don't add up. Times I was there for her that got twisted in her memory. Moments of love that were reframed as obligation. She said she needs to rethink her entire childhood, to re-examine every memory through this new lens. That's a lot to ask of someone. That's a lot of pain to face. But she's willing to try. She's willing to try. We're going to meet next month for coffee. I noticed the way he said the word coffee. The same coffee he had learned to order for himself. The same small act of self-reclamation, now becoming a bridge to his daughter. A thread connecting his recovery to hers. Reconciliation after parental alienation is rare and fragile. The alienated child has built their entire understanding of their family, their childhood, their identity around the false narrative. Questioning it means questioning their own memories, their own perceptions, their own sense of who they are. It means accepting that they were manipulated, that their judgment was compromised, that they may have caused pain to someone who didn't deserve it. Many children never take that step. The cognitive dissonance is too great, the pain too overwhelming, the implications too destabilizing. Emma's willingness to listen, to reconsider, to give her father a chance to tell his side of the story, this was extraordinary. It didn't guarantee a healed relationship. Years of damage cannot be undone in a single conversation or even 100 conversations. But it opened a door that had seemed permanently closed. And sometimes an open door is all you need. Thomas came to our last session looking like a different person. Something in his bearing had changed. He walked in with purpose. When he looked at me, I saw something I had never seen before. He was fully present. "I cried last night," he said. "Really cried. For the first time in decades. I was watching a movie with a father-daughter reunion scene, and I just broke. Everything I hadn't felt for 25 years came out at once. It was terrifying, and it was the most alive I've felt since before I met Margaret." His voice was thick with emotion, but he didn't look away. "I feel things now. Joy when I talk to Emma. Peace when I'm with my friends. Sadness when I think about my mother. It's like being underwater for 25 years and finally breaking the surface." Thomas's journey from numbness to feeling again represents the most fundamental recovery possible. For years, his psyche protected itself by shutting down, but that cost him the ability to feel joy, love, hope. The return of his emotional capacity signified his authentic self was emerging. He was becoming Thomas again. Not the man before Margaret. That person was gone. But a new Thomas. Scarred, wiser, but more present and real than he had been in 25 years. Our final session ended not with words, but with an image Thomas painted for me. His upcoming meeting with Emma. "We're meeting at a coffee shop near her apartment," he said, a small smile playing at his lips. "She's nervous. I can hear it in her voice when we talk. I'm nervous too. We're both afraid of saying the wrong thing, of breaking this fragile thing we're building. But we're both going to be there. That's more than I could have imagined a year ago." What are you hoping for from that meeting? He thought about it for a long moment, really considered the question. "I'm not hoping for forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I'm not hoping she'll call me Dad and everything will go back to normal. Steph, we don't get to go back. That's not how this works. What I'm hoping for is a beginning, a chance to know her as she is now, not as the child I lost. A chance for her to know me as I am now, not as the empty shell her mother created. Maybe we can build something new, something that's ours, something Margaret can't touch or twist or take away." He stood up to leave, then paused at the door, turned back to look at me. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for the therapy, not just for the techniques and the insights and the analysis, but for seeing me. That stranger on the street asked if I was okay, and it was the first time in 25 years someone really looked at me, really saw me as a person, not as a function. You did the same thing. You looked, you listened, you believed me, and that made all the difference." He left my office that day walking taller than he had when he first arrived. Not healed. Healing is a lifelong process, but on his way. Heading toward a coffee shop. Heading toward his daughter. Heading toward himself. I hope this story has helped you see your own life, your own feelings, or the people around you in a different light. I hope this story has helped you understand yourself and others a little better. I'd love to hear something about you in the comments, to get to know you and your story a little more. If you want to share what's inside you, you can write to the email address in my profile. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe. To be notified about the next real-life story, click the bell icon to turn on notifications. Before we end, I want to ask you a few questions. Take a moment to think about them. What do you think about this story? Does Thomas's journey remind you of anything in your own life or in the lives of people you know? Have you ever stayed in a situation that was slowly destroying you because you believed someone needed you? How did that feel? And how did you eventually find your way out? Or are you still looking for the exit? Can wounds this deep truly heal? Or do we just learn to live with the scars? What does healing even mean when someone has spent decades losing themselves? If you could go back in time and speak to Thomas on his wedding day, what would you tell him? And what would you say to the man who sat in that park crying without knowing why? Do you think Margaret knew what she was doing? Was she evil, or was she just repeating the only pattern she ever knew? Does understanding someone's reasons change how we should judge their actions? What about the people who stayed silent? The friends who drifted away? The family members who didn't push harder? Thomas's sister who didn't insist he come to the funeral? Do they share any responsibility, or is it all on Margaret? And finally, is there someone in your life who might be living in an invisible cage? Someone who seems fine on the outside but might be slowly disappearing on the inside? How would you even begin to help them see the bars? What would you say to someone who doesn't know they need saving? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Your perspective matters, your voice matters, your story matters.